Okay, welcome everybody to the fourth and final session of the Freedom of Association Summit of 2021. We're going to go over, as usual, just a few technical points first. Sorry, I'm going to try to get that slide come up. There we go. So here are just a few technical points that are useful for you to keep in mind so you can listen and participate better in this event. First of all, we are quite a multilingual gathering today. The languages of the presenters will be English and Czech, but there's also interpretation into both French and Spanish. And so to make sure that you can follow the conversation and participate, click on the symbol of the globe on the bottom of your screen and select your language. You can select English, Czech, French, or Spanish. And I also like to take the opportunity to remind all speakers in this session to speak slowly. Our interpreters are really, really good, but speak slowly and clearly to make it as easy as possible for them. Then if you do have any technical problems during this event, try to find and select Martina Hooper in the chat and send her a direct message. Also a reminder that this session is being recorded and will be available shortly after the event at electronicswatch.org. So with that, let's get started with today's session. My name is Björn Claesson. I'm Director of Electronics Watch, and I will co-moderate today with Gemma Friedman. Gemma is responsible for business and human rights at the Unison Public Sector Union at in the UK. And Gemma is also a member of the Electronics Watch Board of Trustees. So this is, as I mentioned, the last of our four-part series on freedom of association in public procurement supply chains. And I'd like to do just a brief recap here so you understand how this session fits in with the whole flow of the events that we have been having. In the opening session, we had a really fascinating discussion about the fundamental importance of freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining for workers to be able to address other issues like health and safety, like forced labor, and importantly, also the threat to the climate. In the second session, we asked, well, if freedom of association is fundamental, which the ILO says it is that it is a precondition for other rights, it is the foundation for workers to be able to strive together to improve conditions of work, then we should be able to understand what it is exactly. What rights do workers have under the key ILO conventions on freedom of association and collective bargaining? And does the reality for workers in different countries like the Philippines, like Malaysia or Mexico, as we had represented on that panel, does the reality for those workers actually match the ILO standards? Now, the third session was yesterday, and that session focused on how to verify freedom of association in public buyer supply chains. And here we had some very concrete and practical recommendations from our monitoring partners in India, from an experienced social auditor, and also from a presenter from the city of Oslo, who discussed award criteria for social dialogue in supply chains. And we also highlighted the importance of paying much closer attention to the freedom of association in social auditing. So that's where we are right now. And today, the focus is on remediation. That is, when the freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining is violated in public buyer supply chains, what is a path to remedy? How do we address this? What is the role of the public buyers? What is the role of private sector buyers? What's the role of the factory? And what's the role of the union? Our panelists, our presenters today are two trade unionists and two representatives of public administrations. They are Tomáš Formánek, who is chairman of the Foxconn trade union in Czechia. Marianne Castillo, who is Secretary General of the Metalworkers Alliance of the Philippines, and she is also president of the Nexperia Workers Union. Then we have Cristian Martin, who is Director of Procurement at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. And finally, but certainly not least, we have Christophe Ramon, who is with the International Relations Service with the City of Ghent in Belgium. So welcome to all of you. I'm so happy that you all can join us for this important event. Just a note to everybody who is listening before we go to our presenters. Please put questions and comments in the chat. Then we can have a brief discussion after each speaker. But you're also more than welcome to stay on after the end of the session today, because our speakers today have very generously agreed to stay an extra 30 minutes for more informal conversation. So if your question or it wasn't addressed, or you have another comment, then you can bring that up at the end of the session for more informally. I really encourage you to stay for this if you have the opportunity to do so. So now we will go to our first panelist, our first presenter today. And our first presenter is Tomáš Formánek, who, as I mentioned, is chairman of the Foxconn trade union in Czechia. So welcome, Tomáš, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. So maybe to start with, what can you tell us about the union at Foxconn? How old is the union? How many members do you have? And how well does it work, in your opinion?
Tak s jistotou jsem schopen říci pouze to, že v roce 1990 se naše organizace stala součástí odborového svazu KOVO, kde jsme doposud. Do té doby jsme byli součástí revolučního odborového hnutí, které bylo úzce navázáno na komunistickou stranu Československa. V současné době máme 430 členů, z nichž převážná většina jsou zaměstnanci firem Foxconn v České republice. Mimo těchto členů funguje ještě naše organizace důchodců, která pro své členy každý rok pořádá společenské a kulturní akce. Naši důchodci mají v současné době 230 členů. Odborová organizace Tesla Pardubice má ve svém majetku rekreační zařízení, které máme dlouhodobě pronajaté. Díky příjmům z tohoto zařízení můžeme našim členům vracet formou různých příspěvků téměř veškeré zaplacené členské příspěvky, které jsou stanovené odborovým svazem KOVO. Výbor základní organizace se pravidelně schází a až na výjimky jsou členové výboru aktivní. V posledních letech se nám daří navyšovat členskou základnu a patříme tak mezi výjimku, protože organizovanost v odborech v České republice v poslední době klesá.
Okay. So it sounds like your union is the exception to the rule then, and you have been growing. That's really good to hear. Can I ask you about a collective agreement? Do you have a collective agreement? And if so, how often do you negotiate it?
Tak kolektivní smlouvu sjednanou máme. V posledních letech byla její platnost sjednávána vždy na 3leté období. Kolektivní vyjednávání však probíhá každý rok a vždy se vyjednává minimálně o růstu mezd.
Mm. It sounds like you have active dialogue with the management of the company then.
Ano.
Okay. Could you tell us, in your opinion, what difference does a union make at Foxconn, and why is it needed at Foxconn?
Fungující odborová organizace je vždy zárukou vyšších mezd. Obecně jde říct, že zaměstnanci ve firmách s odborovou organizací mají vyšší mzdy a lepší pracovní podmínky než ve firmách, kde odborová organizace nepůsobí. My bychom si přáli větší počet zaměstnanců v odborech. To by nám samozřejmě dalo větší sílu při vyjednávání. Jsem přesvědčený o tom, že dřív nebo později se vždy ukáže, že návrhy odborové organizace jsou správné, a i když se nevždy podaří vyjednat ihned, tak se k těm našim návrhům většinou po několika letech vracíme. Zmíním třeba prosazení navýšení dovolené, týden nad rámec zákoníku práce v České republice, tak nám to trvalo několik let, přestože je tento benefit ve většině firem, kde působí odbory v České republice. Díky povinnosti firmy projednávat s odbory třeba neomluvené absence v práci se nám občas daří změnit rozhodnutí vedoucích a ta neomluvená absence není udělena. Vždycky hledáme nějaké polehčující okolnosti, aby se nemusel zaměstnanec trestat a vyřešilo se to nějakým jiným způsobem. Můžu také zmínit, že jsme s firmou dojednali v roce 2020 90% náhradu mzdy v případě, že během probíhající pandemie budou problémy se zakázkami nebo dodávkami materiálu. Tak vysoké procento je asi nejvyšší, které jsem v České republice zaznamenal. Význam odborové organizace má však i pro firmu. Přítomnost odborové organizace dokazuje, že firma nepotlačuje práva pracujících, zjednodušuje firmě informování a projednávání některých záležitostí, protože je nemusí projednávat s každým zaměstnancem zvlášť, ale postačuje je projednat pouze s odbory.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's really illuminating. There's a case for the workers, of course, to protect worker rights, better conditions, better wages. There, you mentioned the paid holidays. You mentioned the compensation in case of a necessary stop of production. But you also importantly mentioned that there's a strong business case for having an active union. And I think you also mentioned a viable grievance mechanism. That's also really important for workers. So thank you for that. As you know well, Electronics Watch has conducted monitoring twice now at Foxconn, both at the facility in Pardubice and also lately at the facility in Kutna-Hora. And one thing from our perspective that I have to say is that the very fact that you have this collective bargaining process, that there is dialogue, social dialogues within the workplace, that makes the monitoring and the remediation process so much more effective, because it means that from a perspective of a monitoring organization, it means that the issues that we find during the monitoring process can then be addressed, can then be resolved democratically. At least it can be addressed, at least in theory, it can be addressed democratically within the workplace. And I really think that that is the only path to sustainable improvements in a workplace. But I wanted to ask you one thing. As you know, the second time that we did monitoring at Foxconn, we addressed some trade unions' right. There were some issues regarding trade unions' right to conduct activities in the workplace. For example, we learned that during the pandemic, some workers have had concerns about health and safety, obviously like in all other companies. And some workers wanted to use a petition to see if there was support for a temporary closure of the factory, and then asked the trade union for help. But to our understanding, members of the trade union then reported that they were prevented from collecting signatures during working hours. I'm wondering if you can address this a little bit. Can you tell us about this issue and how it was resolved?
Tak ucelenou odpověď na tuhle otázku, ta by mě zabrala nejspíš celý čas, který tady dnes mám. Já jsem přesvědčený, že největším problémem je v tomto případě legislativa. Velmi zjednodušeně na jednu stranu říká, že odborovému funkcionáři náleží pracovní volno k úkonům, které dělá ve prospěch zaměstnanců, ale zároveň na druhou stranu říká, že bez souhlasu zaměstnavatele takovou činnost nemůže vykonávat. Já se přiznám, že v okamžiku, kdy jsem dostal o této petici informaci, tak jsem kolegy upozorňoval, že by mohl vzniknout problém. Měl jsem totiž osobní zkušenost s peticí ve firmě už z roku 2010, kdy jsme na podporu kolektivního vyjednávání dělali petici v Pardubicích. Kolegové se však domnívali, že když firma nerozporuje jiné aktivity odborové organizace, takže není potřeba žádat o nějaký souhlas. No, následně si odboráře, kteří se ve sběru podpisů angažovali, předvolali jejich nadřízení. Jeden uváděl, že se celý rozhovor vedl v přátelském duchu a byl pouze upozorněn, aby se věnoval své práci a neřešil během ní odborové záležitosti. Druhý naopak uvedl, že mu bylo vedoucím vyhrožováno, že bude sledován nejen během práce, ale třeba i o přestávkách. Třetí odborář měl pohovor, který mu byl nepříjemný, ale netvrdil, že se jednalo vyloženě o vyhrožování. Vzhledem k tomu, že si členy odborů předvolali vedoucí téměř v jednu chvíli, předpokládám, že k tomu dostali pokyn od někoho z vyššího managementu. Já tedy doufám, že se v tomhle případě jednalo pouze o selhání konkrétního vedoucího. Okamžitě po vzniku tohoto konfliktu jsme se pokusili v kolektivní smlouvě ošetřit odborové aktivity neuvolněných funkcionářů. Předali jsme firmě návrh, ale nedokázali jsme s ní najít společnou řeč, proto jsme tento bod odložili, abychom zbytečně neblokovali navyšování mezd zaměstnancům. Později předložila svůj návrh k tomuto tématu naopak firma. Jejich návrh zase nebyl přijatelný pro nás. Momentálně má firma náš nový návrh, který poměrně přesně upravuje pravidla působení odborových funkcionářů. A já jsem rád, že tento incident neznamenal nějaké zhoršení vztahu mezi firmou a odborovou organizací a doufám, že prostě to skončilo těmi nepříjemnými pohovory a je to za námi a můžeme pokračovat dál.
Okay. Well, thank you for explaining this, and thank you for ending this on a positive note here, and giving us just a little bit of a glimpse of the dynamics within the workplace, what can happen, when there is an effective trade union who can have good social dialogue with the management. I also found it interesting that you referred directly to the law here, highlighting the importance of workers to know their rights under the law. In this case, the rights of the trade unions to conduct activities in the at the workplace, because knowing that law is, I think, a very important foundation also to have effective social dialogue in the workplace. Thank you very much, Tomáš. I know that you have only touched on the surface of the issues here. We will have opportunity to come back to you during discussions, both during the session and also if you're able to stay afterwards to address further questions then. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Before we go to the next presenter, I would actually like to bring in a member of the audience today, who is Albert Hoogis, who is contract manager for data centers at the Ministry of Education, Culture and Science in the Netherlands, and which is also an affiliate to Electronics Watch. So welcome, Albert, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. And well, yes, like you mentioned, we are already affiliates from Electronics Watch from the beginning.
Yeah. So the reason that you're here now for just a couple of minutes, and thank you for doing that, is that your agency does procure products that are made by the Foxconn facilities in Czechia that Tomáš represents. And a number of other affiliates do too. So I just wanted to ask you then, now you have heard Tomáš, and why do those issues that he brings up here, why do they matter to the Dutch government in the government's capacity as a public buyer now?
Well, that is of great importance for the Dutch government. We are constantly striving for new ways of addressing these issues on supply chain transparency and workers' rights. And that is one of the reasons why we are affiliate of Electronics Watch, to get this information. It's very difficult for me as a contract manager to oversee what's going on in the supply chain. And we have, as a purchasing department, also the obligation to address this issue on human rights. So the information we got from Electronics Watch is very, very useful. For example, HPE is one of the vendors who is producing in Foxconn in Kutná-Hora. And the information we got from Electronics Watch is a new step towards our approach on this information is very valuable for the Dutch government to see what is going on in the supply chain, how are the human rights being respected or not respected, and what can we do as a purchasing department on this matter. And therefore, in the near future, we invited Electronics Watch to do a presentation in our portfolio ICT, and it is I'm responsible for data center hardware. We make tenders for the whole Dutch government on data center hardware, and one of our biggest vendors is HPE. And therefore it's very important to have this information, to start the conversation with HPE, what I do in my vendor management conversations. And so I addressed this report to my contacts and the sustainability manager of HPE in the Netherlands. And she was very pleased to read about the investigations. And also this information landed on the table of the policymakers, and they see the value of electronic watch and the trade unions in the supply chain to provide us this information. So we are very grateful for the research and the information, and the trade unions have a big role to play in this constantly. Because yesterday I read about a new complaints of the prosecutor in the Netherlands on clothing factories like Nike and C&A. Mm-hmm. Also regarding to the role of the companies you're doing business with, and how important it is to get the correct information on what is going on human rights in the supply chain. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Albert, and certainly the Dutch government, or your agency here, has a very important voice in this whole process, and being able to have constructive dialogue with your supplier, HPE, is really important. And I should mention that the Electronics Watch has had that as well. I think, Martina, if we have one quick question, I think that we have time for one question for Tomáš. If you want to bring somebody in right now, read one question.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we have a comment which I think everyone can read in the chat, but I'll read it out for the sake of the interpreters as well, so it can be translated. Is that okay, Gemma? Shall I go ahead and do that? I know that you answered in the chat whether or not to discuss it now or in the session at the end, but shall I go ahead?
I actually think, Martina, it's a really, really important question, and I think it's probably best dealt with at the end, if that's okay, although I'm really, because I think it's relevant to all of the panelists, not just to Tomáš.
Okay, so we can leave that for the end, and then maybe
that's okay.
There was one other question for Tomáš, so I'll go ahead and read that. Foxconn is famous and notorious for the military style of management on the workers, and that produces lots of pressures to the workers. And in China, workers of different shifts share the same bed and room, and workers are forbidden to speak when they work, so they also often feel isolated. Is it different or similar in Czechia? Sorry if this has been shared, I was a bit late.
Tak u nás naštěstí se k takovýmhle věcem vlastně nedochází. Foxconn v posledních letech výrazně snížil počet agenturních zaměstnanců, takže jich je tam opravdu už jen minimum, a přestože si Foxconn sám zahraniční zaměstnance vozí, například z Mongolska nebo z Ukrajiny, tak ale jim poskytuje ubytovny, a ty ubytovny jsou pravidelně kontrolovány, například audity RBA, kteří dělají nejenom ve firmě, ale i na těch ubytovnách. Takže i ty ubytovny jsou nějakým způsobem kontrolovány, aby tam nedocházelo k nějakým problémům, protože přeci jenom Foxconn je povinen se o ty zaměstnance, protože si je sem přivezl, tak je povinen se o ně postarat se vším všudy. Takže myslím si, že to, co se děje v Číně, tak to tady u nás v České republice nehrozí.
Great. Thank you so much again, Tomáš. And we need to move on to the next speaker. And I'm going to hand over right now to Gemma, who will be moderating the session.
Thank you so much, Bjorn. I think it's been fascinating so far already. So good morning, everyone. So we are focusing on freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining, and when that's violated and what the path to remedy is. And so now we're going to turn to Anne, who is the president of the Nexperia trade union. As we've heard, I understand, Anne, that your union has operated in Nexperia in all its previous forms before takeovers and company mergers that dates back to some decades. But it's not survived without a struggle. Can you give us a few examples of what the types of struggle your union has faced, please?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the nice question, Gemma. Yes, our union has withstood many attempts of union busting. In 2014, for instance, the company illegally dismissed all 24 union officers, including myself, during collective bargaining agreement negotiation. But after our sustained campaign, wherein we held sustained protests inside and outside the company, and support from our allies in the global union and other groups who supported us, we were able to reinstate 12 of the 24 officers, including me. And fortunately, our union is still surviving till now. Last year, at the height of the pandemic, we thought that we will not be able to sign an agreement with the company. But again, with collective action from our members and support from our allies, we were able to clinch another CBA. That's all.
That's really encouraging to hear. Given that the workers in your factory in Nexperia are able to exercise their freedom, their rights to freedom of association, the union is recognized as a social partner by the employer, and a collective bargaining agreement, as you've said, already exists. So remembering, of course, for the audience that Philippines is one of the poorest countries in the world and one of the most vulnerable to climate change, etc. What have been the benefits to the workers over the years within the Nexperia factory?
Having a strong and independent union is really very important for workers to protect their rights and advance their welfare. We are able to secure better wages and regular annual increase for the workers. We are also able to increase the number of regular workers, meaning on our agreement, there will be contractual workers who will become permanent employees, which is very important, especially because contractual worker is very common in the industry. As the broader policy level, our union and alliance, MWAP or Metalworkers Alliance of the Philippines, is also in the front of the campaign for better policies when it comes to safety and health, rights and welfare, secure work and living wage for electronic workers. What I mean is we try to lift the standards in the entire industry, but in order to be more effective, more workers in the electronic sector should be able to exercise their freedom of association.
That's great. I mean, sometimes it's easy to underestimate the importance of even small wage increases, let alone larger ones, or just the ability to have a stable job, knowing that you can be secure in that, and what that then means in your home life and the stress that all of that takes off you, and your ability to you know, not just work, not just live to work, but work to live, as so many people get to do in Europe where I'm situated. So thank you very much, Anne, for that. You've already referred to when the COVID pandemic struck. You know, it was an awful situation for everybody everywhere. And I think about, you know, the frontline workers in, you know, in the public sector who are in the hospitals and in the ambulances, etc. I mean, it was a really, really scary time, and having a collective bargaining agreement in place has been super important for those that have you know, it is a privilege because there's so few compared to those that don't have them around the world. So what happened then? What difference did having a collective bargaining agreement, being seen as a social partner, you know, like, you know, in ideally, you know, an equal, what difference did it make to the workers in Nexperia that collective bargaining agreement was in place?
During the pandemic, we were able to clinch an increase in insurance coverage for medical treatment for COVID-19. We were able to fight for paid quarantine leaves, which are not yet mandated in Philippine laws. With the union, we are also able to ensure that grievances of workers with regards to implementation of safety protocols are heard by the management. And again, as one of the prominent, prominent unions in the electronics sector in the country, we continue to amplify the general demands of the workers for paid pandemic leaves. We were somehow successful in pushing the government to include COVID-19 as an occupational disease, and we are lobbying for easier access to compensation for those who got ill of COVID-19. Recently, our government made a policy that mandates unvaccinated workers to undergo COVID testing before they can resume to work. This essentially discriminates against workers who have not been vaccinated. All unions in the country are united in the stance to resign this policy, but until it is revoked, the company will implement this in our workplace. So in our union, we try to remedy the situation by calling on the management to provide free testing for workers who have not been vaccinated so they can come to work. The point I am driving at is when overall government policy in terms of protecting workers' right is weak or even contrary to protecting workers' right. When there is a strong and independent union, you can remedy the situation or make the standards higher for the workers in your company.
Thank you, Anne. I mean, that is very different, very different situation for the workers in your factory than probably, you know, I wouldn't like to estimate the percentage, you know, 90-something% of workers in factories elsewhere around the world. And I think your union's done an amazing job and should be congratulated for that, you know, and especially doing it in the Philippines as well. Now, you know, you've obviously got the collective bargaining agreement. You know, you're really in a situation of mature industrial relations, which is, you know, what all trade unionists aspire to worldwide within your factory. Doesn't mean it's always perfect or that it, you know, that you won't come across challenges, but, you know, it sounds comparatively pretty good. But as we heard from Julius on day 2 of the summit, who is your union is affiliated to MWAP, and Julius is the national coordinator there. The Philippines is a country with an appalling human rights record and one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a trade unionist. So what's it like? Can you breathe out as trade unionists, as you know, and as workers that are members of the trade union in Nexperia? Has the harassment and intimidation, is it over? You know, what's it like?
Yes, actually, it is continuously happening. 49 of our officers and members are being visited by members of the police, military, and other state security personnel. They are asking about the union, names of the officers, and linking our union to armed terrorist groups. They go to the residences of our members and telling them to quit any union activities, protests, and to disaffiliate to our federation. We strongly condemn this, and we have filed many complaints before the Commission on Human Rights and the Department of Labor and Employment to stop these forms of intimidation and harassment to us.
Thank you. So as well as being really skilled negotiators, you know, you're also incredibly courageous, and, you know, we extend our solidarity to your union. As I said on day 2, no trade unionist should have to go through any of that, not even a tiny amount of it. And yeah, so this makes it even more important, this session and the existence of Electronics Watch. So, you know, given the hostile environment to organize workers in trade unions to collectively bargain in the Philippines, how did, you know, within your own workplace, how did Nexperia respond to this harassment and intimidation that came from outside of the factory, that actually came from state forces? And was Nexperia the only stakeholder or actor to respond?
Well, as per the response of our company, they of course washed their hands of what happened. We are really wondering how these state security personnel learned about the addresses of our members, including me, and we have suspicion that someone from the management gave it away, but they said they had nothing to do with it. And after several rounds of discussion with the management, they assured us of our safety and freedom from that kind of harassment while we are in the company premises. In addition, through Electronics Watch, we were able to raise our concern to the Responsible Business Alliance, or RBA, and the headquarters of Nexperia. And it is a positive step that they issued a statement saying that they do not tolerate any form of harassment and violence against our union, and that they support workers' right to freedom of association. It is really a good thing. At least with that statement, the Philippine government knows that the global business community is watching. However, it also has its limits because it only focuses on our company when there are also other similar issues in other electronic companies. In fact, as it might have been mentioned before, one of our union leaders, Dandy Miguel, who is also from a union in an electronic company, was assassinated. I want to make two final points. One is, despite the attacks in our rights, we are persevering in keeping our union strong, and this benefits the workers in our company and indirectly workers in the sector in general. And it is good that Electronic Watch has some kind of mechanism that allows us to bring our complaints and grievances up to the headquarters and other players in the industry, so that it is a good remedy to the violation of our freedom of association that we are experiencing. The next point is, as I have mentioned earlier, freedom of association is crucial to attaining decent work and uplift the standards in terms of pay, benefits, and working conditions in the industry. We try to do this in the alliance, but as I have mentioned earlier, we need more unions in the industry to be more effective in this endeavor. That I think is a major challenge because it is very hard to organize new unions, and I hope this can be tackled as well, so we not only talk about how to remedy the violations per se of freedom of association, but more importantly, we have to tackle how to remedy the lack, if not absence, of freedom of association in the electronics industry. That's all.
Thank you so much, Anne. I think that was really an excellent, presentation to us about the situation of not only your own union, but also what is happening elsewhere, and also why the Electronics Watch model is such an important and really quite innovative model. And I think we're all excited for, I'm also realistic, but excited for, how we can all move forwards together with, collectively with Electronics Watch to see what, and the public procurers that are the affiliates to see what is possible. So thank you again. Let's move on, unless there are any questions that people have specifically asked for Anne at this point. Martina, did we get anything? No question. Okay, I think we're
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. Not any questions.
Okay.
We've just had a comment which I could read out so it can be translated. Solidarity to Nexperia union in the Philippines. Given the situation of the union busting, red tagging, and extrajudicial killings in the Philippines, so any victory is really a big encouragement to all of us.
Great, thank you. Okay,
Thank you,
so I
Martina.
think we're probably running, I think we're probably running a little bit late, so we're going to swiftly move on now. So, Cristian, over to you. I think you have a presentation for us. If you're able to put that up now, we're really interested to see what public procurement tools there are to drive remedy.
Am I sharing the right screen?
Yeah, it looks good to me.
Okay, good. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I was asked to talk about what we can do with the public procurement rules. And whilst there's more than one way to do things, I just want to focus on what I think is the most direct and objective way, and perhaps in the Q&A later, if people think there's other ways, we can discuss that further. So I want to focus on express versus implied terms, and apologies in advance to English speakers, but I'll read out a lot of the slides to help the translations. But express being written down and implied not written down. So why express terms are necessary, examples of express terms, the key considerations, in particular the EU treaty principles, and when to apply. So this is an example of what you might expect to happen, and to read it out: ensure no laws are broken while making your products. Should this be expressly stated as in written down, or is it just implied in the contracts? Ensure there is a safe working environment for your workers in your product supply chain. Should you have to write that down, or would you just expect that? And ensure your workers in your product supply chain can form a union and have collective bargaining agreement. Should you have to write that down? So why is an express term necessary? So in terms of what the public procurement rules say, this is the particular rule that I'd like to focus on. There are others, we can talk about those in the Q&A later. But in particular, this one that says we may exclude, contracting authorities may exclude or may be required by member states to exclude from participation in a procurement procedure any economic operator in any of the following situations. And it's point G, where the economic operator has shown significant or persistent deficiencies in the performance of a substantive requirement under a public contract. A prior contract with a contracting authority or a prior concession contract which led to early termination of that prior contract, damages or other comparable sanctions. So just to repeat, procurement is hard. If it was easy, everyone would be doing it as best as they could. But what I want to say about this is this is the one that we should be focusing on. And if you were to have an implied contract term, then you're relying on what's called the mandatory exclusions, and that will look for any convictions. And we all know convictions in this space are very difficult. Whereas a discretionary exclusion, you can say that they've not met those obligations. And so if you write them down and they've not done that, then you can say, well, that's not part of our agreement. So you can ask for proactive steps such as audits. You can state what standards need to be checked, such as the ILO standards, and you can agree a process when those breaches are found. So I won't read those out, but I'll summarize. So the first one is about auditing, and in the UK we have a bit of legislation to rely on called the Modern Slavery Act, but it would be different in other countries, obviously. The standards are pointed to the ILO Conventions 87 and 98 for freedom of association and collective bargaining. And the remedy procedure is what you expect to happen if it's found. So here I've stated that if it's found, you would write a letter asking for an action plan within 30 days. So what are the EU treaty principles? So whenever we do a procurement, we've got to observe equality of treatment, transparency, mutual recognition, and proportionality. And it's the proportionality that is the issue here. Whilst some people may think that we can ask for anything we want and can do anything we want, we can't, because if we're disproportional, then it can go to court and they can say, you know, this is such a distant from what I'm required to do under the contract, you're being unreasonable. And that's what they talk about in UK law, a reasonableness test. Was everyone in party to the contract reasonable in their actions and conduct? So an implied term requires a judge to decide if a contractor has not been reasonable. An express term clearly states what is expected by both parties. So now you have your express terms. Are they conditions? And a condition is core to the contract and grounds for termination, versus a warranty, which is subsidiary to the contract, grounds for claiming damages. And it's likely the latter. So to support express terms being substantial and a condition, including the documentation of your tender process and your contract, things like your organization's code of conduct, specifically if it includes an ILO labor standard, and include aspirational statements of your organization, signaling a breach would be in direct conflict with your organization's mission. If you're in healthcare and your contract is making people sick, that is completely in conflict with your organization's purpose. So what I'm saying is you have to be relentlessly thorough and consistent in your communications for suppliers to see how serious you are and to have a chance for this discretionary exclusion method within the directives to be so clear that it doesn't go to court. So to do that, communicate your expectations, highlight this is the new normal for public buyers' expectations, and highlight that by engaging with you in your tender process, you'll support them. You'll guide them through this maze of new requirements and help them meet these new higher standards. So they'll find it easier to win more public sector business in future as a result of working with you. Make it a scored criteria. I believe this has already been discussed, but keep the level of scoring proportional. If it's disproportional, it can be challenged even at the tender stage. Include in the tender a standard contract management agenda where these items can appear as a recurring item. So when we're talking about was it substantial and was it core to the contract, you mentioned it throughout the process and throughout the life of the contract. And train your contract managers who will be the operational contacts on the importance of these issues. And for the procurement people listening, attend the contract management meeting at least on an annual basis, just to cover this specific item to make sure it happens. And you can write a performance letter highlighting that this issue is a significant deficiency in the performance of the substantive requirement of the contract if it is not reported on regularly. So what I want to leave you with is a thought. So this is called the Boston Matrix, and is sometimes used in marketing to describe market growth on the left and market share on the right. But they say that procurement and sales are two sides of the same coin. So this is why we have the same model, but call it slightly different things. So this is the buyer-supplier preferencing model. And here we consider what it means to be viewed in this way. So now consider two customers. They're both working on the same thing. One is really hard to work with, asking all these random questions about freedom of association with no background information and making all these random demands. And now consider the other who wants to support this issue, but shares information, gives lots of notice through early market engagement of its intentions. It rewards effort with a fair amount of points that is achievable in the tender process with its award criteria. And it links good work in the contract management process with more business, so potentially turning a question mark into a star. And to read these out for the interpreters, in the bottom left is nuisance customers, aka dogs. In the bottom right, exploitable customers, cash cows. In the top left, a customer to develop, so a future star, and the top right, a core customer or a star. So I'll try to summarize in what can we do today versus what can I do in my next tender, because they're not the same thing. So use materials from Electronics Watch and other sources to bring this issue to your supplier's attention. Link effort made to them to contract extensions. So if you have put something in place that's like a 2+2 contract, you can link well in advance that if there's progress and effort made, then it can link to that extension. Keep your expectations proportionate to the value of the contract. Engage with Electronics Watch, who can provide verification through worker-driven monitoring. Don't make threats to suppliers, because as we've gone over, it's actually quite difficult to do, but be aware of what you can and can't do. And what can I do in my next tender? Well, you can tell them that you need to do this by using objective scoring criteria. And what I mean by that is, don't say you're going to score poor, good, excellent. Say you're going to score 5 points if you write this letter. You score 4 points if you attend that meeting. You know, be very specific on what you want them to do. Insert non-exclusivity clauses for goods contracts, so you can reserve the right to buy elsewhere. So if you feel like you need to make a threat, you can say, well, I can start buying from someone else until you sort this out. You could also explore the use of a dual award contract if this is something that is persistent and you're struggling to get action, where you split things into primary and secondary positions with a ratio that's reviewed periodically. So would you like to be my 70% supplier or my 30% supplier? Who's making more effort this quarter? And then explore the use of post-contract verification clauses. So what that means is you would say, I expect this action within the first, say, 6 months of the contract. And if you haven't done that, then I'll terminate the contract then. So you can make really strong demands right up front. So to finally say what you want and expect, say what you're going to do and do what you say, and then everything else is going to work out. You're on mute, Gemma.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. Probably the most comprehensive presentation on what you can do that I personally heard. And as someone who's not a procurer, extremely understandable. So thank you very much. And actually, you know, I think your bit about what we can do tomorrow, we could have a really good conversation about that later on as well, and see what else might be possible. Thank you. Let's move on to Christoph now. Your time. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and very happy to be here, of course. And I think the presentation of Cristian is a very good introduction to the work we are doing here in the city of Ghent. I am not a public buyer. I'm not from the procurement department from my city. I work for the team of International Solidarity. So I am the one asking the questions to my public buyers and asking questions like, are we buying stuff in the city of Ghent where workers, unions, and rights are not respected globally? And that is a hard question also for public buyers. And I think the presentation of Cristian already makes clear that we can do something, but making it very concrete, making it specific is always a very hard task. We did it with a couple of years ago. We tried to evolve into a story of textiles because of a rich textile history that we have in our city. It was a story that we in the city of Ghent found very important to carry out. And of course, we also know the working conditions in the textile sector, in the garment sector worldwide are not very good, at least say are bad at some places. So we wanted to make sure that the goods that we buy, the textiles that we buy as a city of Ghent, were respecting workers' unions and workers' unions' rights globally. So we made up a toolbox, and I will be sharing the link to that toolbox in the chat now. And it's dated from a couple of years already, but it's still very useful. And we made a toolbox for every public buyer to make sure that they have the tools at hand to see what they can do in their next tender. The idea of our work that we are doing is that we are going into a dialogue with our suppliers. We think it's very important to go into a dialogue and not just put in clauses in tenders and then follow up if suppliers are doing that work. We've had some contracts like that as well. And then you get very quickly, you get into a quarrel on jurisdiction and things that you don't want to have, actually. And so we made a move to having a real dialogue with our suppliers. And I think that is also what is in Cristian's presentation, very much like just say what you want to your supplier as well, upfront before you put out a tender, and have that discussion. That's something that we also did. We had a market dialogue, and we came up in the end, and I'll be sharing a part of the toolbox now. We came up with, I hope you all can see this, but we came up with a process of working together with our suppliers and having different phases for the different lots that are in the tender. We have 5 lots. You will read about that in the toolbox. But I want to emphasize the work that we are doing on working together with suppliers and how we are working together. First of all, we ask them to engage with us and see where we can go on transparency and how we will be working together. I think that's the basic step you need to take. But much more important are these very colorful 3 steps that we also had. It's the second step, it was transparency. And transparency meaning we wanted to know where our textiles were made, how they were made, and even on production side, we wanted to go, and that in a 4-year term. The contract was awarded in 2018. It should end next year, but we have a prolongation, so that's okay. But we wanted to go there in 4 years' time. I will tell you that we didn't make that. We won't make it because there are a lot of products within this contract. And for every product, there is a global supply chain with a lot of different suppliers attached to it. For one product, I can give that example. For safety shoes, for example, there were 200 different components in a safety shoe, and our supplier just didn't find all the connections and couldn't trace the full supply chain. We're still working on that, but it's clear that it's very complex to have full transparency in your supply chain. But even then, for the products that we do have, we want to move forward to a 3rd step, and that's the action level. We want corrective action plans when we are faced with human rights violations or workers' union rights violations. If we notice that we have in our supply chain and we have transparency on a certain product, then we want to have an action plan correcting those wrongs. And then at the 4th level, we want leadership of our suppliers, which means that they will have management systems in place to prevent in the future that we will be working with production sites, for example, where workers' union rights are violated. The leadership part is like the way ambitious road. We are still not there. I'm being very honest about that. We are on a 3rd level of action, corrective action plans for some products. And that's where I come in with the story that it's also very limited and it takes a lot of capacity from our part to have that kind of transparency and have that dialogue with our suppliers and then have that corrective action plan on the site, on the level of the workers. But I can tell you that we had, for example, we have 4 cases, and I call them the 3 good cases and 1 bad case, but we have to share the bad cases as well. But we had the 3 good cases where we are working still on corrective action plans with 2 production sites, for example, in Bangladesh and 1 in Vietnam. And I'll go to the bad case first. We also had the connection with a production site in Ethiopia, where we knew that some products were made that we are buying. And our supplier, who was providing us with the information, didn't tell us that they did tell us that there were some troubles there in the production site, but no worries here. Our supplier said, we just changed production site and we went somewhere else. That made us react on the fact that that's not what we wanted. We don't want you to change production site because there are union rights not respected. We want you to change that in the production site where you're working at this moment. So that was a little mix-up or a little misunderstanding between our side as a client and a supplier side. But we are doing good work in the 3 other cases, and especially I would like to mention the Bangladesh work that we are doing, because we are also working locally with NGOs that are involved in the Bangladesh Accord, which is the global accord that has to respect safety rules for the production sites of, especially on textiles. And we are working with the NGOs involved in that story to have also a locally monitoring system to see if things are improving. I think I'll leave it here and leave some room for questions, of course. But that is generally the story that we are writing as a City of Ghent on the textiles story. We are now moving forward as well on Fair ICT together with Electronics Watch. We have a big tender coming up. It will be approved this week by the Board of Mayor and Deputy Mayors. We have a big tender coming up for the ICT materials that we need for the upcoming 5 years. And of course, we are mentioning and working together with Electronics Watch to see if we can change something in the global supply chain for ICT materials as well. But I wanted to bring the story, of course, of textiles because we have a lot of experience in that. But there's a lot of similarity between those 2 products, although it's not completely the same.
Great, thank you so much, Christoph. So it was really fascinating to hear the kind of more strategic bird's eye view from yourself, as well as then, of course, a much more technical view from Cristian. We do have, I think, a couple of questions in the chat, but I wonder, I might be able to weave a little bit of that into the next session of this, and I'll certainly try. And if I don't, then we'll get them answered, at least in the informal session, if not, if we can't make our time up before that. But thank you very much for that. So we've heard from all the panelists now, and now we'd just like to kind of take things a little bit further and think about, you know, what meaningful stakeholder engagement in remediation is. And I think what we can say for sure is that it's so much more easy, as Bjorn has already said, if a collective bargaining agreement is already there when violations occur, so that you know, the process that, you know, trade unions exist there, and then the process becomes easier to remediate, and the outcomes are more likely to be good ones. And so let's just focus a little bit maybe on that process for now, because, you know, is the process that leads to the outcomes, and we're trying, I think, with Electronics Watch to be able to really get down into that, to be able to share it with as many as possible. So thinking about all the stakeholders, and this is really for Anne and for Tomáš, when violations need to be remedied, to be put right, thinking about all the stakeholders, including your union, who do you think should be involved in that process? Like, who could be involved, and who would you like? Either Anne or Tomáš. And if you haven't understood the question, please do let me know. Anne, Tomáš, are you still with us?
Ano, jsem.
Hi, Tomáš. Great.
Tak
What was the question
tak
clear?
většinou, když dojde k nějakému konfliktu, tak je to mezi firmou a odbory, případně mezi firmou a nějakými konkrétními zaměstnanci. To znamená, že ten, kdo by ten problém měl řešit, tak samozřejmě tyhle dva partneři, ale zřejmě teda by bylo asi potřeba, nebo úplně ideální, aby tam byl ještě někdo, protože v tu chvíli jsou vlastně v konfliktu. Ty dva sociální partneři, tedy odbory a zaměstnavatel, jsou v konfliktu a bylo by dobré, aby ten jejich konflikt někdo řídil, protože vlastně ty zájmy těch dvou stran můžou být protichůdné. Takže buď je potřeba mít opravdu perfektně nastavený pravidla, co můžu, co nemůžu, anebo bych tam měl mít někoho, kdo to bude nějakým způsobem korigovat, když dojde k nějakému problému, protože to řešení může být někdy jednoduché a rychlé, ale jindy může být téměř nedosažitelné.
Thank you, Tomáš. Yes, often mediators are very much needed. Somebody actually asked in the question whether or not it's possible, can a procurer, I think that was Dara asked, can a procurer insist on dialogue with the supplier's trade union? I suppose that's saying, you know, can there be a direct contact between the two to try to get some of the facts ascertained and perhaps to play a more direct role? I wonder if any of you, Christophe or Cristian, Thomas, yourself as well, you know, that having that direct contact with each other, is that possible? Is that something you'd like to see more of?
I definitely would like to see some more of that direct contact. As a public local authority, we cannot force our supplier to have a conversation with a workers' union. We cannot put that in the tender as like, you have to do this. What we do, what we can say is refer to international standards and emphasize the importance of workers' unions. And we have done that in the cases of the textiles. We made sure that there are connections made, for example, and if they don't progress on the corrective action plan that I was talking about, we always have the opportunity to end the contract, and that is a pressure that we can put on suppliers as well. If the dialogue isn't working, we'll not hesitate to put the pressure on it and see how we can improve the workers' conditions, like, for example, having the conversation with workers' unions. So there's not a direct force to say, have a talk with workers' unions, or you should be in the same room and make a connection, but there are indirect ways to do so.
Great, and you yourselves, of course, there's nothing to stop you from speaking directly to the trade unionists.
Absolutely, and yeah, building capacity also for them and informing them what we can do in their place. Absolutely.
And which is very powerful and empowering for trade unionists to know that there are others that are there with them and they're not just on their own. Thank you very much, Christophe. So Anne, I know I noticed that you maybe something had gone wrong technologically. Are you with us again now? Can your screen come on? I can see you're the very last person. I'm not sure how we can change on the Zoom. Anne, can you hear us? I can see. Okay. Well, for now, we'll just keep we'll keep going. Cristian, did you want to say anything in response to that?
Yes. Whilst it's possible, we have to consider the issue of proportionality, where it then becomes a potential cause for complaint from the supplier side that we're just being unfair to them. So in order to consider that, that's why I put in the model of the Boston matrix, or the supplier buyer preferencing model. Try and consider where the procurer is at the moment, if there's actions that the procurer can do to move into a different box. So that could be buying more than one item at the same time to make the value of the contract more substantial. Or it can be working with a consortium arrangement whereby the needs of your organization and other organizations are combined. So we're trying to make the size of the contract as big as possible to give you, as the procurer, the greatest power as possible, and therefore the demands that you're making are becoming more proportionate to the contract value.
Thank you very much. And Anne has indicated that her connection is unstable. We'll try to come to Anne in a moment then. So when we think about these kinds of things, I mean, it is possible to put those in your contract terms then, isn't it? And Electronics Watch already has freedom of association and collective bargaining in as options for procurers to include in the contract terms.
Yes, so that's why I pointed to the directive, and specifically point G, where you've illustrated in your contract through the pre-market engagement, the tender process, and the actual contract, that it's substantive and core to the contract. There is another part of that same directive that focuses on social, environmental, and labour violations, and why you can't rely on that one specifically, even though that's what it's designed to do. You can't rely on it because it requires a conviction, which then takes you back to what would otherwise be a mandatory exclusion anyway, because they've been convicted of a crime, as well as what was the other? A conviction. Oh yes, of course. And in terms of remedy, what the court would say, if you were to take it to court and say, look, they're in violation of these things through their subcontractor, the court will say, well, when did this become known? If it became known at the tender stage, then we're able to exclude them. But if it became known during the contract and the delivery of the contract, then the remedy is actually to change the subcontractor. And that's what was said in a case law court case. I can point people to if they're interested in it. It was an Italian court case. So yeah, you can't rely on it because the outcome from the court is not what we want. We want to start dialogue. Yeah,
absolutely. And how about engaging with the company? So you can also engage at a headquarters level. Do you think it's possible to get the company at the headquarter level to sometimes even try to engage with the governments? So of course, you know, we'd heard, for example, in the Philippines of what is happening there. Now it may or may not work with different governments, but then might there be possibilities for you as a public procurer to be able to engage at a headquarter level with the company and ask them to make representations to say, unlike the message that's been given for so many decades from organizations like the World Bank, that a good business environment is, you know, in the doing business model, that a good business environment is poor, weaker labor standards, that actually, you know, it's preferable to have stronger labor standards and stop harassing or violating trade union rights. How about that?
Well, in terms of what can we do about our supplier's supplier, and we're thinking about that 4-box matrix again. Sorry for keep referring to the same thing. Me as a public buyer, I'm going to be a limited view, but my supplier, and it's the subcontractor that's the issue, my supplier will also be a customer of many to the subcontractor. So in order to move ourselves into a greater position of power, one of the objectives from my contract could be that we write a joint letter. So me and my supplier do as you suggest, but then on behalf of myself and some of their other customers, who are also members of Electronics Watch, hopefully.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Bjorn, have you got anything that you would like to ask in the last part of this session?
Well, I see a number of
Questions.
A number of questions in the chat here. Maybe one to follow up on here is what Kessler was just asking at the very end, which I think is an interesting dynamic. He is highlighting the fact that if you're a big buyer and have a lot of procurement, then maybe you have more influence. But at the same time, if you have if you have a very big contract, does that somehow also limit your flexibility to move your orders in response to either improvements that the industry is making or lack of improvements?
Well, in terms of that, if the contract is so large, it's questionable you're getting value for money by having a single supplier in any case, as well as the fact that with all of the supply constraints at the moment, whether it's wise to limit where you buy your things from anyway. So that's, if you refer back to the slides, one of the suggestions I made was if it was such a large contract, to see if there can be opportunities for a primary and a secondary provider, and you could pivot between the two constantly based on who's making the most effort in this area.
That's interesting.
So it's not impossible, but we have to be creative in the solutions, because I think there's acceptance that there's problems throughout the electronic supply chain, and there's no one brand that's doing everything correct. So we're going to have to play them off each other in some way or another.
Christoph, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick in on the question, because it is something that I hear a lot from the political level of my city. Well, let's just combine everything. So we have a big contract. And then if you have a big contract, you can have more impact on your supplier, and they'll listen because they don't want to lose a big contract. But it's not that easy sometimes. Sometimes it's much easier with a smaller, if you're a smaller buyer, because you have a good relationship, for example, with a certain supplier, and then you can have that dialogue. So it's I think it's very complex, and it's not as easy as to say, well, big or small contracts will make the difference. That's just something I wanted to add.
Gemma, you're on mute.
I have another question. What about speaking up publicly as you know, public buyers, and obviously with the say-so of your leadership about some of these issues, to offer the type of support that we've been talking about? Could you foresee that type of situation happening? I mean, certainly I've seen that with the private, you know, with the brands, for example, speaking up about things that, you know, advocating for things that they'd like to see in particular joint industries, or sorry, in specific industries, or with specific problems that have been happening. But what about the public sector in terms of you as procurers?
It's a good question. I mean, there's wiser people on the call than I to answer this, but my understanding is that if you make it too confrontational, you shut down dialogue. So I would take the lead on someone better experienced than I on these types of negotiations, but it's not something I would jump to.
And it is a hard question, because you do want to speak out, and you do want to emphasize and also raise awareness on the fact. On the other hand, you don't want to name and shame the suppliers that you're working with. And that's always a double one. And especially as a city, we have, of course, our administration, and I have my personal thoughts on some corporations, for example, but as a politician who has to talk about that and has to present that kind of case, it's always hard to speak out on certain issues. And we are working at this moment on a framework on human rights in our international contacts, for example. It's the same with procurement. We want to mention and we want to emphasize the fact that we think human rights and human rights being respected are very important for our city. But at the same time, you don't want to scare off the partners you're working with. And there's like a gray zone. Where's the line that if you cross this kind of work, is this the point that we say, no, we won't be working with you anymore? Or are you still going into a dialogue? And that's a very, very hard question.
Absolutely, and it takes a lot of diplomacy. And I think perhaps this is something we could even have a discussion about, you know, with Electronics Watch further to look at what that could look like, what good would look like. Beyond, is there anything else you would want to?
Let me, Tomáš, if it's okay with you, I'd like to bring you in again just before we close right now, because there have been a couple of questions here in the chat about migrant workers. And I think the question is from our representative of a monitoring partner in Taiwan, Lennon, and Lennon Wang, and they work very closely with migrant workers from a range of Asian countries in Taiwan. And the question I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit about the situation of migrant workers in Foxconn, but maybe also generally in Czechia, and what what kind of challenges you see there for migrant workers and how you're meeting them.
Tak Foxconn v současné době nabírá zahraniční zaměstnance zejména z Ukrajiny a funguje to tak, že vlastně Foxconn jim vlastně se postará o to, aby se dostali do České republiky se vším všudy, to znamená pomáhá jim s vyřizováním víza, prostě hradí jim náklady a podobně. Pak přijedou do České republiky, Foxconn vlastně jim poskytuje ubytovnu, poskytuje jim v současné době po dobu 18 měsíců příspěvek na bydlení, ať už bydlí na té ubytovně, nebo prostě z ní odejdou a seženou si bydlení někde jinde. Největším problémem tady asi je, že prostě je nedostatek bydlení u nás v Pardubicích, ale i v Kutné Hoře, takže to bydlení je předražené, pokud ho vůbec seženou. Takže opravdu, a ne každý chce dlouhodobě bydlet na té ubytovně. Takže asi největší problém tady těch zaměstnanců vnímám v tom zajištění toho vlastního bydlení. Další problém, další je to, že vlastně zaměstnanci podle zákonu mají možnost po půl roce, vlastně kdy tady pracují, si sem přivést svoje rodiny, což mnozí tak činí. A vlastně to je další důvod, proč si schání vlastní bydlení, protože samozřejmě se svou rodinou nechtějí bydlet na ubytovnách. A pak už jsou tady jazykové problémy, protože spousta těch zaměstnanců není schopná se domluvit, takže vznikají různé komunikační bariéry a podobně. Já si myslím, že se firma snaží, snažíme se i třeba my, takže třeba i jsme si přeložili naše náborové letáky, kromě češtiny, do dalších 7 jazyků. Musím říct, že i firma nám s tím pomohla, že nám zajistila některé překlady, takže v současné době máme už zhruba 1/3 členů naší organizace právě tvořenou těmito zahraničními zaměstnanci. Jsem přesvědčený o tom, že prostě to jinak nejde, že se musíme věnovat i jim, protože ten jejich počet roste už několik let a zřejmě to bude pokračovat i nadále. Takže myslím si, že pokud bychom se na ně nesoustředili, tak si myslím, že by význam té odborové organizace pomalu upadal a my se snažíme samozřejmě sehnat i lidi třeba do vedení odboru, takže můžu zmínit, že ve výboru máme Mongolku. Zatím se nám ještě nepodařilo sehnat Ukrajince, který by uměl česky a mohl být taky ve výboru, ale určitě se o to budeme do budoucna snažit.
Great. Thank you so much, Tomáš. And we are at the 90-minute mark here. So I wanted right now take the opportunity to actually formally close this session and formally close the the whole Freedom of Association Summit for this year. And I wanted to thank all the panelists for your really wonderful, insightful contributions today. I really love the dynamic we've had with so much insight about the freedom of association situation in Czechia and in the Philippines, and then the detail from Cristian about what exactly can a procurer do according to the law, and Christoph's stories about what they are actually doing. So I hope this dynamic feels constructive to everybody. So again, thank you to Tomáš, Marianne, Cristian, and Christoph. Thank you for everybody for participating and listening. This is the formal end of the summit, but you're more than welcome to stay now. We'll end the recording and have more informal conversation. And so for everybody who wants to stay, please do so.